Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me today for this week's edition of SMIE Consulting's Midweek Roundup. So happy to be joining you today on this Wednesday, October 24th, for a roundup of three issues that, while closely related, will impact international students' offices around the country. From the admissions side to the student services side, there's a lot going on that want to share with you today on these topics, and I'll share with you in just a minute just a few of my insights on what's going on in the business of international education. And it's really a challenge these days to understand which way the winds are blowing with regard to government policies, student practices in different countries. So really encouraging you to stick with me for the next half hour or so as we go through these three topics for some very hopefully enlightening discussions on what's happening in international education as it relates to international students coming to the United States and some of the various obstacles that they and universities that try to enroll them experience. So, live now. So for those not familiar with our live chats, these are Wednesday occurrences every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we cover a range of topics related to international education, from a sampling of news stories that I've seen over the last 7 days that may directly impact a number of international admissions and international education folks in the audience that are following us here at SMIE Consulting. So thanks very much for joining me today. Looking forward to some discussion on these three topics. The three topics today are changes to the China market, great article from ISEF Monitor on some of the kind of on-the-ground research on what's happening in China today as it relates to study abroad. Then we'll talk a bit about a planned change to student visas, limits on student visas in the United States. But before we get to that, we'll also cover Good West report on institutional perspective on international recruitment agents. So we'll cover all that in the next 30 minutes or so. So sit back and join in the conversation as we do go through these very interesting topics. The first one I'll cover is from an ISEF Monitor article that appeared this past week. That related to 4 changes that are shaping the Chinese recruitment market. For those that have been recruiting in China for a number of years, some of these will be refreshers for you, but those who are just new to China will be eager to learn how the Chinese market is diversifying. For those working in China, China's a constantly moving target in terms of students and where students are going for information, who they're relying on, where the student flows are going. U.S., as we know, has been in a very fortunate position where in the last 4 or 5 years, last decade actually, we've seen a huge explosion in Chinese students coming to the United States, primarily at the undergraduate level. And increasingly, you see Chinese students coming for STEM fields, as not just to the United States, but other countries as well. And what the ISEF article does go into some very good detail on is how the demographics in China are now sharing information that it's not just the upper middle class or rich that are sending their students abroad now. It's Chinese students and parents at every level of Chinese society are now jumping on the study abroad bandwagon. And in the past, that's meant a lot of those students have been going to English-speaking countries. U.S., Australia, UK, Canada have been primary beneficiaries of the Chinese students looking for English language education abroad. But we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, Chinese students now considering multiple destinations. And the ISEF article does go into some depth on as to where and why those are. So that's the second major change factor in China, that it's not just study abroad for everyone now, where you're seeing many smart markets in smaller cities are continuing to grow in terms of study abroad, and that they're also considering more destinations. For those who are working with agents in China, you're probably familiar with BOSSA, BOSSA. That organization accredits agencies in China or trains agencies in China to operate. And it's you see what's happening. Students are now and families are now considering more destinations for simple fact that costs are increasing for Chinese students to study in their own country. So now it's they're looking abroad. They're not just looking at the traditional English language speaking countries, but they're also considering Japan. They enrolled in Japan over 110,000 Chinese students enrolled in Japanese universities in 2017, 12% increase over the year before. And a lot of EU countries are benefiting, including besides the UK, but France, Germany, and not an EU country, but Russia are certainly benefiting from huge influxes of Chinese students. So it's a combination of increased disposable income on the part of middle class families in China, but it's also part of looking for other options depending on visa policies and work opportunities after graduation. So all of these things are impacting where Chinese students are spending their dollars abroad. So it's good to keep an eye out on this, and certainly ISIF has done a good job referencing the different factors that are on the ground that are impacting why and where students are going. And part of why other destination countries are becoming prominent for Chinese students is, you see, China's part of their soft power, if you call it, policy on the One Belt, One Road policy that it's been a massive foreign development and investment framework that they've developed over the past decade or two that has meant billions and billions of dollars of Chinese funds have been used to build up ties with regional neighbors and everything from infrastructure to business to employment, so covering a wide range of fields that have developed stronger ties with neighboring countries in South and Southeast Asia. So, and that also extends to Africa as well. So Chinese students are really seeing more opportunities available to them abroad than just the traditional ones. And one of the pieces in the ISIF article I found useful is that it had some information about Chinese students using educational agents that actually was a little bit surprising, considering some of the stories I've heard in China. Related data from JJL Overseas Education indicated that nearly 57% of Chinese students that go abroad do so with the help of an education agent, as opposed to 13.4% that register directly with institutions or abroad. So it's good. Students are relying, maybe decreasingly so, on agents, educational agents, but certainly not a proportion. Only 13.4% using direct representation with the universities and abroad. So there are other non-agent information sources like Education USA for those that are considering the United States, British Council for those considering UK, IDP for students considering Australia. So there's a lot of different options available to students, and it looks like they may be checking out multiple options now as they move forward. The final piece that ISIF mentions on this front is what is happening is that students, families especially, are spending a lot of time researching who they're going to work with if they're going with an agent. So that 80% are carefully considering the qualifications of agency counselors. So there is an attempt to seek the best quality rather than just paying the money to get their son and daughter into any particular school that they want. So that's encouraging to see that. The quality of the agencies is now coming into the discussion when it comes to what parents are considering. So, great article altogether, and I certainly recommend colleagues getting a sense of what is going on in China. Really take a look at what that means for families in China that are looking to send their children abroad. But like we've talked about in previous episodes, in China, it's not just the U.S. anymore. It's never actually was just the U.S. It's still the #1 destination for Chinese students. But there you have many more options now. There are many more of them going abroad, but they have many more options to choose from. Much like the global international student mobility pie that we've talked about before, the pie has gotten a lot bigger in terms of the number of students that are traveling outside their home countries for higher education, but it's also become a much more competitive pie. Many more players have entered the game to both recruit and to receive and to send students abroad. So it's important for institutions to really understand where they fall. And an article I have coming out for Hot Courses Abroad tomorrow will focus on what that means, the relationships and that institutions have, and particularly U.S. institutions have, with the world outside their own as they look to recruit students, realizing the ever increasingly globally competitive market that they're in. So realizing that their major competitors are not necessarily just their U.S. rivals, they're other countries. So it's now a position where institutions in the U.S. have to talk about themselves not just as their institutions, but as a U.S. institution, as the United States. And that's a challenge that I think a lot of institutions have some struggles with. So we'll be interested to see how that shakes out in the weeks and months to come. But China is certainly a good bellwether for where things are going, and certainly it's reflective of a much more competitive market. As the article from ISEF referred to, educational agents are certainly a big part of how Chinese students and parents are making decisions as to how and where to go to get their information for study abroad opportunities. One other piece that I just posted to the comments section on the Facebook page for your reference is an article that came out from WES, World Education Services, last week on the institutional perspective on international recruitment agents. There's been an awful lot written about how students in different markets are using agents fairly heavily over the past decade or two, particularly as it relates to other countries, but increasingly in the U.S. So what we've seen, and the article is probably one of the best that I've seen from an a U.S. perspective that really looks at all of the issues involved, both positive and negative as they relate to agents. And it does a good job of actually identifying some alternatives to agents for U.S. institutions that are looking to recruit abroad, including Education USA and embassies and Fulbright commissions and such. Thanks for joining, Jacoby. Glad to see you're on board. Hope you're doing well. What this article from WES also talks about in relation to the use of educational agents is that in the United States in particular, there's been really a tripling of interest on the part of universities that are using agents. From 2011, there were perhaps 11% that were engaging agents abroad to recruit their students, to now almost a third, according to an American Council on Education report from 2017. So in that report, WES is looking at a number of different factors that are impacting why institutions are choosing to use educational agents. And what they've done in their review is they've worked with a number of institutional representatives from U.S. colleges and universities that have relationships with agents, and they've put together a fairly well thought out and thorough report on the motivations for institutions that are using agents. And that's what are some of the cautionary tales, and for example, what happened at Western Kentucky University a couple of years ago, where 25 out of 60 students that had been admitted to the university had basically been admitted with fraudulent credentials, and they didn't have the necessary academic prerequisites. The agents and agencies that exist out in the wild world that will misrepresent institutions, that's a fairly common occurrence. So it's something that I really see as a challenge for institutions that are going down the agent route. Can it be done right? Yes, it can, but it requires a whole heck of a lot of oversight and administration to manage. And there's a lot of institutional accountability, transparency, and integrity issues that NACAC, in its good work, the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, their commission report that they produced in 2013 that addressed the issue of the ethical ethical nature of using agents, that they did not prohibit the use of agents, which had previously been the case in NACAC Code of Conduct, or Code of Ethical Standards. But they did say that that institutions that do decide to go with agents must do so with their eyes wide open and have accountability and transparency and integrity involved. And in fact, they've now made it, and I was just seen some tweets about this in the last few days, NACAC is now requires that if member institutions who use agents actually publish the names of those agents on their websites for international students. So that's something I think, again, goes to the transparency and integrity issues that institutions should be approaching the use of agents with. So it's looking like the trend has certainly been on the upward swing for use of agents in the United States. But we're seeing in other countries, for example, maybe 30% of students using agents. That's small compared to Australia, where it's 3/4, almost 75% used agents in 2016. And in the UK, more than 92% used international agents as part of their recruitment to their admissions to those institutions in those countries. So within the U.S. context, why they employ agents, there's a lot of research that's been done that signing agents is in a way helping to increase enrollments without having to provide on the ground recruitment or logistics to companies abroad. It's a face for an institution in a certain country. Of course, many of the agents that U.S. institutions work with these are commission-based agents that are working for potentially a number of different institutions, but maybe not only in the United States, but with other countries as well. So in other countries that have a lot of agents in place already, you're seeing parents are looking at, particularly in countries where they're looking at undergraduate education, they're relying on their secondary school counselors, when I started in this business about 25 years ago, secondary school counselors did not exist in most schools other than international schools outside the United States, or schools that send a predominant number of their students to study outside that country. So now it's becoming increasingly common. Certainly there's a lot of different organizations out there. Education USA is the gold standard as far as I'm concerned for non-agent based advising for students to help students get a sense of what the options are for study in the United States. But what are some of the positives for institutions that have decided to work with agents who see it maybe as a more low-risk strategy? There's some debate about what that is as well. Increasing enrollments is key. The out-of-state or the full tuition kids that often are sought out by universities to help support their budgets. You see agents are often seen as an extension of recruitment teams. So I've worked at institutions that have used agents and did no travel in the past, and institutions that used agents and those agents were supplementing what the institution did on the ground with their own institutional staff traveling abroad. You see agents often as a good source of market intelligence, what's going on the ground, to get that kind of inside scoop on whether their programs are still marketable to students in those countries. So those are certainly some of the more commonly referred to positives of working with agents. The negatives are you have to know who you're working with and their reputation, and the potential for fraudulent documents to come your way. It can be a huge stumbling block in any relationship with agents that are not properly vetted, and even ones that maybe had been previously and might be undergoing some rough times. They might be forced to do some things that they wouldn't normally do. So there's some challenges here that whether the student's not giving the agent the complete information about their academic profile, or the agent is doing the misrepresentation themselves. So fraudulent documents is a huge piece to worry about, not just on the educational side of their academic credentials, but also funding-wise. Some agents purport to do a thorough vetting of the financial capabilities of the student and their parents before submitting their applications. Others will just have a bank statement generated that they can send along with an application, really not pay any attention to it. So a real challenge is with the vetting that institutions need to do, the management of those agent relationships. The lack of a response is a challenge sometimes working with agents, that you're as institutions developing a lot of time and effort into working with these agents abroad. And there's some real challenges. So kudos to Wes, though, for putting together a very detailed analysis of agents and some of the important pieces of information that institutions really need to take into consideration when they're making the decision to work with agents abroad. So last, and certainly not least, but certainly the most frustrating piece of news that I think international educators have seen in the last week is the now planned attempt by fall of 2019 to establish a maximum period of authorized stay for international students and other holders of certain non-immigrant visa categories. Now, for those who have been designated school officials or responsible officers at their institutions for international students, when they're admitted to the United States, they get that stamp in their passport. Used to be on their I-94 and their passport, but now in their passport, when they get that stamp on their visa, on the visa page, opposite their visa page, it says F1 or J1 D/S, DS, duration of status. Certainly, it's one of those maybe carved out loopholes that it exists I don't know if it's a loophole, but it certainly is an anomaly for most visa categories in the United States, in that DS basically means a student can maintain their existing status, their F1 or J1 status in the United States for as long as they maintain their status as a student. As those who work immigration know, the visa that students get in their passport from the U.S. Embassy or consulate abroad, that's just that initial key to unlock the door to the United States to enter the house or enter the country. It does not, that visa, if the student doesn't go home at all after they arrive, that visa could well be expired a year or 2 years into a student's stay in the United States. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they're out of status. Only would mean they're out of status if they are not currently enrolled in a university or college in that F1 status at the time that their visa expired. The visa is only important, or has been up until now, for students when they enter the country. So if they were to go home after a year of study, but their initial visa was only valid for a year, they would have to apply to get a new visa at the U.S. consulate or embassy before they could re-enter the United States. So what's the big deal here? One thing I don't know, that I would love to see a story that looks at how other countries view visa stays of students and the lengths of stays of students, the maximum, if they have maximum durations of stay for students that are coming to their institutions. Now, there's still a lot of detail, and the caution here is there's still a lot of detail that we do not have yet about this plan that would go into effect a year from now, for fall 2019, and that's the length. What is that maximum length that students can stay? Because conceivably, you could have a student that comes to finish their high school in the United States, maybe their junior and senior year of high school, continues on at a U.S. college or university for a bachelor's degree, then maybe goes for a master's and then a doctoral degree that could be in student status under the current immigration law, could be in that student status for duration of status, the way it's currently written, for potentially 10, 15 years. 4 years of undergrad, or 2 years of high school perhaps, 4 years of undergraduate, 2 years for a master's, another 4 or 5 for a doctoral degree program. And that's not including any time that student might take after associate, bachelor's, or master's degree or doctoral degree for practical training work authorization. So there's a huge amount of time, a variance that could exist for a student that comes in to study to finish high school, to finish a bachelor's, master's, doctoral degree program, there's a huge amount of time difference that could be that student could be in the country for. So how they come up with these rules for what the maximum authorization would be and what it actually means. If they are still maintaining valid F1 status, do they have to apply for an extension of that status, which they do anyway internally through their DSOs when they apply for an extension of stay? Say their bachelor's degree, initial I-20 for their bachelor's degree was only 4 years, but they're going to need a 5th or a 6th year because they've added a second major, changed majors in there. Sometime that's going to impact their amount of time they need. So if they have an extension of stay, they're already doing that. When they apply for a new degree, they're going through an admissions process for that. Well, they have to do and an immigration process through CBIS to get a new I-20 for a new degree program. Will there be some sort of requirement that when they finish one degree, they have to apply from within the United States for a new student visa, or require that they go home to apply for a new student visa and then re-enter? So really, there's some interesting details that still need to be revealed about this plan, but there's some obvious danger signs that exist out there in terms of what that might mean for U.S. institutions that are looking to recruit abroad, and the competitive disadvantage, again, realizing that we are in a very globally competitive marketplace for students. What's that going to mean? And this is where I'd love to see an article and maybe do some research on what similar situations are in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, and how international students, if there are limits on the maximum amount of time that they can stay in country. So that's something, it's just something to keep your eye on as details emerge on this one. I know for many of you, it's, and I'll shift gears a little bit, talking a little bit about what we're doing at SMIE Consulting. One of the things I always try and do is just keep my my colleagues informed as to what's going on in the international ed business, and particularly social media, and how that impacts it in different stories. And I put out a weekly newsletter now that we've now are into our 5th edition. We just released one on Monday this week. It comes to your inbox every Monday, 9 a.m. Eastern, and that'll have a roundup of the top stories, just some briefs with links to those stories that can help you as you navigate what those stories might mean for you and your institutions. So I encourage you to subscribe to that newsletter. It's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and the link to the newsletter has just been posted on in the comments section on the Facebook page. Certainly invite you to check that out. If you've missed past editions of this weekly chat on the Midweek Roundup on the Facebook page, there is also an archive of those on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you, I've posted the link to that playlist on in the comments section as well. And lastly, for those who are looking perhaps to take the next step with some of their recruitment materials or their overall strategies, would encourage you to check out and how SMIE might be able to help. I've got some great resources on our SMIE website at smieconsulting.org. Posted the link to that in the comments section as well. Invite you to check that out if there are any projects, social media audits, website audits. If you're looking to do some more long-term planning, I do workshops on campus. So there's a lot of different ways that I might be able to help you down the road. So encourage you to check those out. And I want to say thanks again for joining us today, and look forward to connecting with you in the weeks and months to come. Have a great day.